The night was heavy with a silence that felt unnatural, pressing against the windows of the small cabin like an unseen predator. Emily hadn't intended to spend the weekend alone, but her boyfriend, Mark, had been called into work last minute. It'll be fine, she had reassured herself. What could happen in the middle of nowhere? The cabin was a cozy retreat in the woods, miles from the nearest neighbor. Surrounded by towering pines, it was the perfect place to unwind, or so she thought. As the hours ticked by, the isolation started to weigh on her. The sound of the wind rustling through the trees became louder, more insistent, as if something unseen moved just beyond the porch light's reach. It was just after midnight when she first heard it. A faint knock at the front door. She froze, her hand hovering over the remote. The knock came again, louder this time. Emily's heart pounded in her chest. Who could be out here at this hour? For a moment, she debated ignoring it. Maybe it was the wind or a branch hitting the door. But then she remembered the warnings Mark had given her about wildlife. Could it be a bear? Slowly, she crept to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peek outside. The porch was empty, the light casting long shadows over the wooden planks. Nothing moved. Her breath caught in her throat as the knock came again, this time from the back door. She spun around, her pulse racing. No one could move that quickly, and yet someone or something was clearly there. She grabbed the fire poker from the hearth, gripping it tightly as she edged toward the back door. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. No response. Just silence, thick and suffocating. As she approached the back door, she saw it. A shadow, long and gaunt, stretching across the kitchen floor. Her breath hitched. The figure stood perfectly still, just outside the door, its outline distorted by the frosted glass. It was tall, too tall, and its limbs seemed unnaturally thin, like branches stripped bare in winter. Emily's hand trembled as she reached for her phone, but the screen was dark. No signal. Of course. Out here, she was completely cut off. The shadow shifted, bending unnaturally as if it sensed her fear. Then a low scratching sound began, nails or claws dragging across the wooden door. "Go away!" she screamed, backing into the living room. The scratching stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. She could feel its presence waiting just beyond the thin barrier of the door. Then came the voice. "Emily." It was a whisper, hoarse and guttural, but unmistakably her name. Her blood turned to ice. She hadn't told anyone she was here. No one except Mark knew, and he was hours away. The fire poker felt useless in her hands, but she clung to it like a lifeline. The lights flickered, then went out entirely, plunging the cabin into darkness. Panic surged through her as she stumbled toward the fireplace, hoping to find matches or a flashlight. The whisper came again, closer this time, as though it was right inside the room with her. "Emily? Let me in." "No," she shouted, her voice cracking. "Leave me alone." A loud bang echoed through the cabin as something slammed against the front door. Then another. The wood groaned under the pressure, and Emily knew it wouldn't hold for long. She scrambled to the bedroom, locking the door behind her. Her chest heaved as she pressed her ear to the door, listening. The banging had stopped, replaced by the creak of floorboards. Whatever it was inside now. Tears streamed down her face as she dialed 911, knowing full well there wouldn't be any service. The line crackled, and to her shock, it connected. 911. "What's your emergency?" "Someone's in my cabin," she whispered urgently. "Please, send help." "Stay calm," the operator said. "We're tracing your location now." But then the voice on the other end changed. It wasn't the operator anymore. "Emily, why are you hiding?" She dropped the phone in horror as the bedroom door handle rattled. The door shuddered as something heavy threw itself against it. The frame splintered, and Emily backed into the corner, clutching the fire poker. The door burst open, but there was no one there. Just darkness. And then, out of the shadows, a figure emerged, its face pale and stretched, eyes black as voids. It smiled, revealing teeth that were jagged and wrong. Emily screamed as it lunged toward her, the fire poker slipping from her grasp. The next morning, when Mark arrived, the cabin was eerily still. The doors hung open, and the living room was in disarray. But there was no sign of Emily. Just her phone lying in the middle of the floor, its screen cracked. He picked it up, and the last thing she recorded played automatically, her frantic breathing, the sound of her footsteps, and a voice, low and chilling, whispering her name. "Emily." The moon hung low in the sky, veiled by a shroud of dark, swirling clouds, casting fleeting shadows over the desolate road. Jake tightened his grip on the steering wheel, glancing nervously at the clock. 1:14 a.m. His car hummed steadily as he drove through the empty countryside, the trees on either side looming like silent sentinels. The trip back from his sister's wedding had taken longer than expected, and now he was regretting his decision to take the scenic route. His GPS had died hours ago, leaving him with only vague memories of the map he'd glanced at before leaving. The road stretched endlessly ahead, winding through darkness that seemed to deepen with every mile. His radio crackled faintly, the static an unsettling reminder of just how isolated he was. Every so often, Jake glanced in the rearview mirror, though he didn't know what he was looking for. The backseat was empty. It always was, or so he thought. As he rounded a sharp bend, his headlights caught something, a flash of white darting across the road. Jake slammed on the brakes, his heart leaping into his throat as the tires screeched against the asphalt. The car skidded to a stop, the sudden silence deafening. He squinted into the darkness, his breath fogging the windshield. At first, there was nothing but the shadows of trees. Then he saw it, a figure standing just at the edge of the forest, pale and motionless. It was a woman, dressed in a tattered white gown, her hair matted and falling over her face. Jake's stomach churned. She didn't move, didn't wave for help or step forward. She just stood there, her head tilted slightly as though watching him. Rolling down the window, he called out, "Hey, are you okay? Do you need a ride?" The woman didn't respond. Her bare feet were half buried in the overgrown grass, and her shoulders were unnaturally rigid. Something about her felt wrong. Jake swallowed hard, resisting the urge to drive away. She might be hurt, he told himself, or lost. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out of the car, the cold night air biting at his skin. "Miss?" he said, taking a cautious step toward her. Still, she didn't move. As he approached, the wind picked up, carrying with it a faint, sickly sweet smell. Jake hesitated. There was something off about the way her gown hung, torn and stained, and the way her hair obscured her face entirely. "Do you need help?" He tried again, his voice faltering. Suddenly, she moved, jerking her head up sharply. Jake stumbled back, his blood running cold. Her face was pale and hollow, her eyes sunken and black as voids. But it was her mouth that froze him in place. It was twisted into an impossibly wide grin, her teeth sharp and jagged, glinting in the dim light. She took a step forward and then another, her movements unnatural, like a marionette pulled by invisible strings. Jake backed away, nearly tripping over his own feet. "I'll call someone for you," he stammered, fumbling for his phone. The woman stopped, her head tilting to the side again, as if amused by his fear. Then, in an instant, she was gone. No sound, no movement, just gone. Jake blinked, his heart pounding. He spun around, his eyes scanning the dark woods. Where? A sharp knock on the passenger window made him jump. His head snapped toward the car. She was there, sitting inside, her grin stretched even wider, her black eyes fixed on him. Jake didn't think. He bolted for the driver's seat, slamming the door shut and locking it in one fluid motion. His hands shook as he fumbled to start the car, the engine roaring to life. In the rearview mirror, she was still there, sitting unnaturally still, her grin unwavering. Jake floored the gas pedal, the car lurching forward. The woman didn't move. She just stared at him, her dark eyes boring into his as the car sped down the road. He didn't dare look back again. For miles, the road stretched on, the forest thinning as he neared civilization. His breathing began to steady, though his hands still gripped the wheel so tightly his knuckles ached. Finally, lights appeared on the horizon. A gas station, its fluorescent glow a beacon in the darkness. Jake pulled into the lot, throwing the car into park before jumping out. His legs felt weak beneath him as he ran into the building. The cashier looked up from his magazine, startled by Jake's disheveled appearance. "You all right, man?" he asked. There was a woman," Jake stammered, glancing over his shoulder at the car. She was in my car." The cashier frowned. "What are you talking about?" Jake turned back to the car, his heart pounding. The passenger seat was empty. There was no sign of her. "I swear she was there," he whispered, more to himself than the cashier. "She was right there." The cashier shook his head. "You've been on that road, huh? Lot of folks see her out there." Jake froze. "See who?" The man's expression darkened. "They call her the Grinning Woman. Supposed to be some bride who died in a wreck decades ago. They say if she gets in your car..." He trailed off, his eyes narrowing. Jake's blood ran cold. What happens?" The cashier leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. You don't make it home. Before Jake could respond, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Trembling, he pulled it out. It was a notification from his GPS, a route to his home location. He hadn't turned it on, but the address wasn't his. It was for a cemetery. The gravel crunched beneath Sarah's tires as she turned down the old forest road. Her GPS insisted this was the shortcut to her friend's cabin, though the road seemed anything but inviting. Towering trees lined the path, their skeletal branches reaching out like claws under the dim glow of her headlights. The signal had dropped 10 minutes ago, and the silence was oppressive. Even her trusty old car radio, usually a source of comfort, emitted only static. She tried not to think about the horror stories her friends told about these backwoods. Urban legends, she muttered to herself, gripping the wheel tighter. The road narrowed, and Sarah slowed, squinting at the darkness ahead. That's when she saw it. A figure standing in the middle of the road. Her heart leapt into her throat as she slammed on the brakes. The car screeched to a halt, just feet away from the figure. It was a man, or at least she thought it was. He was tall and thin, wearing tattered clothing, his face obscured by the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. For a moment they stared at each other, or rather she stared at him. The man didn't move. His stillness was unnerving, his head slightly tilted as if studying her. Sarah's instincts screamed at her to drive, but her hands froze on the wheel. She rolled down the window just enough to call out, "Do you need help?" The man didn't respond. Instead, he raised an arm and pointed down the road, not toward her, but into the forest on her left. A chill ran down her spine. The gesture was slow, deliberate, and wrong. It felt like a warning or an invitation. She shook her head. "I'm not going in there," she said, more to herself than to him. Her voice sounded small, even inside the car. She eased the car into reverse, trying to put some distance between her and the unsettling figure. The headlights briefly illuminated the forest to her right, and her stomach flipped. Between the trees, she caught a glimpse of something moving. Many things, actually. Pale, gaunt shapes darting from shadow to shadow, just beyond the edge of the light. Her breathing quickened as she shifted back into drive. She decided she didn't care if this road led to the cabin or not. She was getting out of here. The man didn't move as she swerved around him, her tires spraying gravel. But just as she passed, she glanced at her rearview mirror and froze. He was no longer alone. Figures emerged from the trees on either side of the road, stepping into the light. They were thin and pale, their eyes hollow sockets, their mouths gaping as if locked in silent screams. There were dozens of them, and they all stared directly at her. Sarah floored the gas, her car roaring as it sped down the road. The figures didn't give chase, but their haunting presence stayed burned in her mind. She glanced at the mirror again, only to see the man in the hat standing in the middle of the road behind her, watching her go. The road seemed to stretch endlessly, and the forest felt darker than before. Her pulse thundered in her ears, and every shadow seemed to move. She told herself she was imagining it. She had to be. Then she heard it, a low, guttural sound like breathing. It wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from the back seat. Her stomach twisted as she dared to glance at the rearview mirror again. Her heart stopped. Sitting in the back seat was one of the figures. Its hollow eyes met hers in the mirror, and it slowly opened its mouth. A sound escaped, not a scream, but a deep, rumbling growl that didn't belong in this world. Sarah screamed and swerved, nearly running off the road. The figure lunged, its skeletal hands reaching for her neck. She jerked the wheel again to bat, and the car fishtailed before slamming to a stop. She scrambled out of the car, not daring to look back. The forest was eerily quiet now, as if holding its breath. Her headlights flickered, and she thought she saw the figures again, standing in a line at the edge of the trees. The man in the hat was in front, closer this time. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Against her better judgment, she pulled it out. The screen was black, except for a single text message. "You shouldn't have come here." Sarah dropped the phone and ran, the sound of her heartbeat deafening in her ears. The road behind her vanished into darkness, and she didn't stop until she saw the faint glow of lights ahead. A gas station. She stumbled inside, gasping for air. The clerk looked up from behind the counter, his face pale. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said. Sarah didn't respond. She couldn't. She turned to look back through the station's glass doors, and her blood ran cold. In the distance, standing at the edge of the woods, was the man in the hat. He raised his arm and pointed again. This time he was pointing directly at her. The storm rolled in quicker than expected, the sky shifting from a soft twilight to a menacing, inky black. Jessica was halfway home on the empty highway when the rain began to pour in heavy sheets, blurring her vision. Her wipers worked furiously, but the road ahead was a smeared watercolor of dark asphalt and streaking headlights. Her phone buzzed in the cup holder. A message from her roommate. "You okay? This storm looks bad. Text me when you're back." She sent a quick voice reply. "I'm fine, just a little slow going. See you soon." The static-filled voice-to-text icon blinked strangely, but Jessica brushed it off as bad reception. A flash of lightning illuminated the road, and she caught sight of a sign. Rose Hollow, 10 miles. She didn't remember passing through Rose Hollow before. The name wasn't familiar, and the exit wasn't one she'd ever noticed. Jessica glanced at the GPS, but the map wouldn't load. "Great," she muttered, gripping the wheel tighter. The storm worsened, the wind howling like a living thing outside. She nearly missed it. A figure on the side of the road, drenched and staggering. Jessica slammed on her brakes, her heart racing as the car fishtailed before coming to a stop. She squinted through the rain-soaked windshield. It was a woman, her clothes clinging to her like they'd been soaked for hours. Jessica hesitated. She'd heard the stories, warnings about picking up hitchhikers at night. But the woman looked desperate, her face pale and drawn. Reluctantly, Jessica rolled the window down a crack. "Do you need a ride?" The woman didn't speak at first, just stared at her with wide, unblinking eyes. Then she nodded, her movements stiff and mechanical. Jessica unlocked the door, and the woman slid into the passenger seat without a word. Water pooled beneath her as she sat, her hands resting limply in her lap. She didn't look at Jessica, just stared straight ahead. "Rough night, huh?" Jessica said nervously, trying to fill the silence. The woman turned slowly, her head moving as if on a hinge. Her lips parted, and her voice came out in a raspy whisper. "You shouldn't be here." Jessica frowned. "What do you mean?" But the woman didn't answer. Instead, she pointed out the windshield, her bony finger trembling. Jessica followed the gesture and felt her blood run cold. Ahead, the road seemed to vanish, not into darkness, but into nothing. A void stretched before them, swallowing the highway, the trees, and even the rain. It was as if the world itself ended in a jagged black maw. Jessica hit the brakes, the car skidding to a stop. "What the hell is that?" she breathed. "You need to turn around," the woman said, her voice shaking. "It's waiting." "What's waiting?" Jessica demanded, panic rising in her chest. The woman didn't answer. She simply reached for the door handle and stepped out into the storm. Jessica leaned over, shouting, "Wait! Where are you going?" The woman turned back, and in the glow of the dashboard light, Jessica saw her face clearly for the first time. Her eyes were hollow sockets, empty and dark. Her lips twisted into a smile far too wide for her face. "It's already here," the woman whispered. Before Jessica could react, the passenger door slammed shut on its own. The woman was gone. Just gone. Jessica's breathing hitched as she stared at the empty seat, the lingering wet imprint of the woman's form, the only sign she'd ever been there. The car's engine sputtered, then died. The headlights flickered and went out, plunging Jessica into darkness. The only sound was the relentless pounding of rain and the distant rumble of thunder. Then, from the rear of the car, she heard it, a faint, deliberate tap, tap, tap. Jessica froze, her hand hovering over the keys. She didn't want to turn around. She didn't want to see. But the tapping continued, steady and insistent, moving closer along the side of the car. Her shaking hand gripped the ignition, and she turned the key. Nothing. She tried again, her foot slamming the pedal, but the car remained silent. The tapping stopped. For a moment, the world was silent, except for her own ragged breathing. Then, a voice, low and guttural, rasped from right beside her ear. "Where do you think you're going?" Jessica screamed and lunged for the door, tumbling out into the storm. She scrambled to her feet, her clothes soaked instantly, and bolted down the highway. Behind her, the car remained dark, the void ahead seeming to stretch closer. She didn't stop running, her lungs burning, her legs screaming in protest. The rain fell harder, blurring her vision, but she didn't dare slow down. She thought she heard footsteps behind her, heavy and deliberate, but she didn't look back. Hours later, a truck driver found her staggering along the road, her face pale and her eyes wide with terror. She couldn't explain what had happened, couldn't describe what she'd seen. The trucker frowned. "You were out near Rose Hollow, huh? That place ain't on the map for a reason." Jessica's voice trembled as she asked, "What do you mean?" He hesitated before answering. People disappear out there. The ones who make it back, they don't talk about it. You're lucky you ran. Jessica shivered, her mind replaying the voice in her ear and the tapping on the glass. She didn't feel lucky. She felt like it was still following her, and maybe, just maybe, it was. The clock struck midnight, and the echo of the chime seemed to hang in the air longer than it should have. Ben glanced at his watch to confirm the time. Midnight on the dot. The flickering fluorescent light above him buzzed faintly, casting erratic shadows across the dimly lit parking garage. He was the last one left at the office. Again. Overtime had become a routine, but the eerie silence of the underground garage always unsettled him. His car was parked in the farthest corner where the shadows clung like cobwebs. As he walked, his footsteps echoed louder than usual, a rhythmic reminder of just how alone he was. Or so he thought. Halfway to his car, he heard it. Another set of footsteps. Soft, deliberate, and slightly out of sync with his own. Ben stopped abruptly, his breath catching in his throat. The sound stopped, too. He scanned the garage. The rows of parked cars stretched into the shadows, but there was no movement, nothing out of place. He chuckled nervously, convincing himself it was his imagination. He started walking again. The footsteps resumed. Ben's pace quickened, and so did the other steps, always staying just far enough behind him to keep him guessing. He reached his car and fumbled with his keys, his hands trembling as he unlocked the door. He slid inside, slamming the door shut and locking it. His heart was pounding as he glanced in the rearview mirror. The back seat was empty. He let out a shaky laugh, feeling foolish. It was probably just the echo of his own footsteps, distorted by the empty garage. The engine roared to life, and he pulled out of his space, eager to get home. As he drove toward the exit ramp, something caught his eye in the mirror, a shadow darting between the cars behind him. He slowed for a moment, peering into the mirror again. Nothing. He shook his head, muttering, "Get a grip, Ben." The car ascended the spiraling ramp, emerging into the open air. The city lights were distant pinpricks in the hazy night, and the streets were eerily deserted. He turned onto the main road, trying to shake the lingering unease. A mile down the road, he saw it. A figure standing on the shoulder, illuminated by his headlights. At first, he thought it was someone hitchhiking. A tall man in a dark coat, his face obscured by the shadows of a hood. But as Ben got closer, he noticed the man wasn't standing. He was floating, his feet a few inches above the ground. Ben's grip tightened on the wheel, and his breath caught as the figure's head turned toward him. Under the hood was no face, just a swirling void, dark and endless. He slammed on the accelerator, speeding past the figure. The road stretched endlessly ahead, but the air inside the car felt stifling, heavy. He glanced in the rearview mirror. The figure was now standing in the middle of the road, perfectly still, watching him drive away. Ben kept his eyes on the road, his heart racing. He didn't dare look back again. A few minutes later, his phone buzzed on the passenger seat. He jumped, startled by the sudden sound. He hesitated before picking it up. It was a text from an unknown number. "You can't run forever." Ben dropped the phone, his knuckles white as he wheeled. The wheel. The streetlights above him flickered as he drove, casting fleeting pools of light on the dark road. Ahead, the road split into a fork. His GPS was still open on the dashboard, but the screen was blank now, a faint static hissing from its speakers. He chose the left path, his instincts screaming at him to keep moving. As he drove, the scenery began to change. The streetlights disappeared, replaced by an oppressive darkness. The trees lining the road seemed taller, their twisted branches reaching toward the car like gnarled hands. His headlights illuminated something ahead. A sign. It read, "End of the road." "What the hell?" Ben muttered, slowing the car. The road abruptly ended in a dense wall of fog. He slammed on the brakes, his car skidding to a stop just before the mist. The GPS crackled to life, its robotic voice cutting through the silence. "You've arrived at your destination." Ben stared at the fog, his breath quickening. The temperature inside the car plummeted, and his breath turned to mist. A faint tapping sound came from the passenger window. Tap, tap, tap. He didn't want to look, but he couldn't stop himself. Slowly, he turned his head. The figure was there, inches from the glass, its void-like face inches from his own. It tilted its head as if curious, and then raised a hand to the window. The glass began to frost over, spiderweb cracks spreading from the point of contact. Ben screamed and threw the car into reverse, slamming the accelerator. The tires squealed as he backed away from the fog, his eyes darting between the windshield and the rearview mirror. The road behind him was no longer the same. The trees were closer now, their twisted forms pressing in from all sides. Shadows darted between them, keeping pace with the car. His phone buzzed again, the screen lighting up with another message. There's no going back. The engine sputtered, and the car shuddered violently before coming to a dead stop. The headlights flickered, then went out, plunging him into darkness. In the silence, he heard it again. Footsteps. This time, they were all around him. The cold wind howled as Lisa zipped her jacket higher, her breath forming faint clouds in the frosty air. She regretted taking the walking trail so late in the evening, but the shortcut through the woods was the fastest way home. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their skeletal branches swaying against the darkening sky. The trail was eerily quiet, save for the crunch of her boots on the gravel. Normally, the sound of distant birds or rustling leaves would break the silence, but tonight there was nothing. Even the wind seemed muffled once she stepped deeper into the woods. As she walked, she noticed something strange. Her shadow. It stretched out in front of her, long and distorted, though there was no light source behind her. She stopped and turned, expecting to see a car's headlights or the glow of a street lamp. There was nothing but darkness. Her heart began to pound. She told herself it was just her mind playing tricks. But as she turned back to the trail, she saw another shadow. This one was longer, darker, and moving. It wasn't hers. Lisa quickened her pace, refusing to look back. The crunching of gravel behind her matched her steps. Her breathing quickened as she broke into a jog, but the sound stayed close, just a few paces behind. She risked a glance over her shoulder and froze. The shadow was there, but it didn't belong to anything. No figure, no person, just the shadow itself, darker than the surrounding night. It moved unnaturally, slithering along the ground like it had a mind of its own. Lisa turned and bolted, her footsteps frantic as she sprinted down the path. Her lungs burned, her legs screamed, but she didn't dare stop. The sound of gravel shifting behind her grew louder, closer. The trail forked ahead, and she veered left without thinking, hoping it would lead her to the main road. Instead, the trees seemed to close in tighter, the path narrowing into a tunnel of branches that clawed at her jacket and hair. Then the sound stopped. She stumbled to a halt, her chest heaving as she gasped for air. The oppressive silence returned, so heavy it pressed on her ears. Slowly, she turned to look behind her. Nothing. The trail was empty. Relief washed over her, but it was short-lived. When she turned back to the path ahead, she screamed. A figure stood in front of her, cloaked in shadows so dense they seemed to absorb the faint light around them. Its face, or what should have been its face, was featureless, smooth like polished stone. It tilted its head, as if studying her, and then stepped forward. Lisa stumbled back, her mind racing. She tried to scream again, but no sound came out. The figure raised an arm, impossibly long and thin, and pointed past her. She didn't want to look, but something compelled her to turn. Behind her, at the far end of the trail, shadows emerged from the trees, dozens of them, crawling and slithering like living things. They stretched and twisted, merging into one massive, writhing darkness that crept closer with each passing second. Lisa turned back to the figure in front of her, her voice finally returning in a panicked whisper. "What do you want?" The featureless head tilted again, and, though it had no mouth, she heard its voice, cold and hollow, echoing in her mind. "You took the wrong path." Before she could react, the ground beneath her feet shifted. She looked down and screamed. The trail had disappeared, replaced by an endless void of black, swirling nothingness. She scrambled backward, but the figure reached out, its shadowy hand grazing her arm. The cold that shot through her wasn't physical. It was deeper, sinking into her bones, her mind, her very being. Her vision blurred, and the world seemed to twist and collapse around her. When she woke, she was lying in the middle of the main road, her jacket torn and her hands scraped. A car honked, swerving to avoid her as she scrambled to her feet. The driver pulled over, yelling, "Are you okay? What are you doing out here?" Lisa didn't answer. She couldn't. She glanced back toward the woods, but the trail was gone. Only an unbroken line of trees remained, their dark silhouettes swaying in the wind. She made it home that night, but the shadows never left her. Every time she walked into a dark room or turned off the lights, she felt them, watching, waiting. And sometimes in the silence of her apartment, she still heard the gravel crunching behind her. The small motel sat off a desolate stretch of highway, its neon sign flickering weakly against the backdrop of the pitch-black night. Kelly had been driving for hours, and exhaustion clung to her like a second skin. The idea of a bed, no matter how uncomfortable or questionable, was too tempting to pass up. The clerk at the front desk barely looked up when she entered. He was an older man, his weathered face illuminated by the sickly fluorescent light above. "Room 6, he said, sliding a key across the counter without making eye contact. His voice was flat, disinterested. "Long night?" she asked, trying to make small talk. The clerk's gaze flicked up for a brief second. His eyes were bloodshot, and something about them made her uneasy. "Just don't leave your room after midnight," he said, his tone as bland as before. Kelly forced a laugh. "Why, is there a curfew?" The clerk didn't answer. He just stared at her until the silence became unbearable. "Okay, sure," she muttered, grabbing the key and heading to her room. Room 6 was at the far end of the row, the door creaking loudly as she pushed it open. The room was exactly what she expected, old, musty, and just clean enough to not be disgusting. She threw her bag onto the single bed and collapsed beside it, too tired to bother changing out of her clothes. She set an alarm for 6 a.m., plugged in her phone, and was out in minutes. Kelly woke suddenly, her heart pounding. For a moment, she didn't know why. The room was silent, the only sound the faint hum of the air conditioning unit. She glanced at her phone. 12:03 a.m. Her eyes darted to the window. The thin curtains billowed slightly, even though the window was closed. The air felt different, heavy, like the room was holding its breath. That's when she heard it. A faint scratching sound like nails against wood. It came from the door. Kelly sat up, every nerve in her body on edge. "Hello?" she called, her voice shaky. The scratching stopped. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she stared at the door, waiting. The silence stretched, growing more oppressive by the second. Then the sound came again, this time from the window. Slow, deliberate scraping. Kelly froze. Her mind raced as she tried to rationalize the noise. Maybe it was a tree branch or the wind. But there were no trees near the motel. Just the empty parking lot and the highway beyond. She slid off the bed and crept toward the window, her breath shallow. The curtains were thin, almost translucent, and the dim glow of the flickering motel sign seeped through them. She reached out, hesitated, and then quickly yanked the curtains aside. There was nothing there. Her reflection stared back at her in the glass, wide-eyed and pale. She let out a shaky laugh. "Get a grip, Kelly," she muttered, pulling the curtains closed again. The scratching moved to the bathroom. Her stomach dropped. The sound was louder now, insistent, as if whatever was making it wanted her to know it was there. She backed away, her eyes locked on the closed bathroom door. "Hello?" she whispered again, her voice barely audible. The scratching stopped, replaced by a faint creaking. The doorknob was turning. Kelly stumbled back, her hands groping for anything to defend herself. She grabbed the bedside lamp and yanked it free of its cord, holding it like a weapon. The bathroom door swung open slowly, revealing nothing but darkness inside. The light from the bedroom didn't seem to reach beyond the threshold, as if the shadows were swallowing it. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice trembling. A sound came from the darkness, low, guttural breathing. It was deep, deep, and uneven, like something that wasn't used to lungs trying to mimic the act of breathing. Kelly backed toward the room door, her free hand fumbling for the lock. The breathing grew louder, closer. She could see something now, a shape emerging from the darkness. It wasn't a person. It was too tall, its limbs too long, its movements jerky and unnatural. She screamed and threw the lamp at the thing, bolting for the door. Her hands shook as she unlocked it and flung it open, stumbling into the cold night air. She didn't stop to look back as she ran toward the office. The clerk was still there, sitting behind the desk as if nothing was amiss. He looked up as she burst in, her face pale and her chest heaving. "You left your room," he said calmly. "Something's in there," she cried. "There's something wrong with this place." The clerk sighed, shaking his head. "I told you not to leave after midnight." Before she could respond, the lights in the office flickered and went out. The room plunged into darkness, and for a moment there was silence. Then came the scratching. It was on the glass of the office door. Kelly turned slowly, her breath catching as she saw the shape pressed against the glass. It was grinning now, its face impossibly wide, its hollow eyes staring straight at her. The clerk's voice came from behind her, calm and almost bored. It always finds the ones who don't listen. The rain hammered against the windshield as Ryan pulled into the long gravel driveway. He had finally made it to the Airbnb he'd booked for the weekend, a secluded cabin deep in the woods, far from the stress of his everyday life. The photos had promised a cozy retreat, rustic charm, a fireplace, and absolute solitude. The cabin looked exactly as advertised, though the surrounding forest felt denser than he'd imagined, the tall trees swaying ominously in the storm. He parked his car, grabbed his bag, and jogged up the steps, his shoes splashing in the growing puddles. The wooden door creaked open under the weight of his shoulder. Inside, the cabin was warm and inviting. A crackling fire had already been lit in the stone fireplace. That was strange. He hadn't told the host when he'd arrive. Maybe they had guessed based on the weather. Ryan shook off the thought. The warmth was welcome after the cold rain, and the soft glow of the fire made the cabin feel alive. He dropped his bag near the couch and wandered into the small kitchen. A single plate sat on the counter, along with a note. "Welcome, Ryan. Make yourself at home." The handwriting was neat but oddly formal, as though whoever had written it didn't quite know how to strike a friendly tone. After drying off and making himself some tea, Ryan settled into the couch with a book. The storm outside had grown fiercer, the sound of the wind howling through the trees making the cabin feel even cozier in contrast. The clock on the mantel ticked softly, marking the minutes as he lost himself in the pages of his novel. Then, a thud. Ryan froze, his eyes darting to the window. The storm outside raged on, the rain streaking the glass, but he couldn't see anything beyond the reflection of the firelight. He told himself it was a tree branch falling, or maybe an animal. This was the woods, after all. But then he heard it again. Another thud, this time heavier, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the porch. Ryan's heart began to race. He set the book down and moved quietly to the window, peeking out from the corner. The porch was empty, but the wooden planks were slick with water, as though something or someone had been standing there moments ago. He locked the door, his hand trembling. "Probably just the wind," he muttered under his breath, to stay, trying to convince himself. The hours dragged on, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. Ryan eventually fell asleep on the couch, the fire dwindling to embers. He woke with a start, unsure of what had roused him. The clock on the mantel read 3:12 a.m. The room was silent except for the faint patter of rain against the windows. Then he saw it. The cabin had a large mirror above the fireplace, and in its reflection, Ryan could see the living room behind him. But something was wrong. In the mirror, there was a figure standing in the far corner of the room. Ryan's breath hitched. He didn't dare move, his eyes locked on the mirror. The figure was tall, unnaturally so, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its face was obscured, shadowed by the dim light of the dying fire. Slowly, he turned his head to look at the corner. There was nothing there. His gaze snapped back to the mirror, and the figure was gone. The room behind him was empty again. Ryan shot up from the couch, his heart pounding. He grabbed his phone, his fingers fumbling as he tried to turn on the flashlight. The cabin's lights flickered and went out. "Hello," he called out, his voice shaking. The silence that answered him was deafening. A creaking sound came from the hallway leading to the bedroom. It was slow and deliberate, as if something was dragging itself along the wooden floor. Ryan backed toward the front door, his phone's weak flashlight trembling in his grip. The creaking stopped. Then came a whisper. Faint and barely audible, it seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You shouldn't have come here." Ryan's fingers fumbled with the lock as panic overtook him. He yanked the door open and sprinted into the storm. The rain soaked him instantly, but he didn't care. He just needed to get to his car. As he reached the vehicle, he heard it again. The whisper, clearer this time, as though it were right behind him. "It's too late." Ryan threw himself into the driver's seat, locking the doors and starting the engine. The headlights illuminated the driveway, but the gravel seemed to stretch endlessly now, the forest pressing closer on either side. He slammed on the gas, speeding down the winding path. The trees whipped past him, their shadows stretching unnaturally across the road. He glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. The figure was sitting in the back seat, its hollow face inches from his own. It grinned, its teeth impossibly sharp, and whispered one last time, "You'll never leave." The car veered off the road, and the world went black. The next morning, the Airbnb host arrived at the cabin to check on their guest. The fire was still burning faintly, the room untouched. The only sign of Ryan's presence was his car, abandoned halfway down the driveway, its doors wide open. Of Ryan, there was no trace, and in the mirror above the fireplace, if you looked closely, you could almost see a shadow. Waiting. Watching. The night was unnervingly quiet as Claire parked her car in front of the old farmhouse. The place had been her grandmother's, a creaky two-story relic surrounded by acres of untamed woods. Claire hadn't been there in years, not since her grandmother's passing, but now it was hers. She had planned to stay just long enough to clean it up and decide if she wanted to sell it. The house looked more ominous than she remembered. The peeling paint, the sagging porch, the way the windows seemed to stare back at her, it all made her skin crawl. She reminded herself it was just an old house, empty and harmless. With a deep breath, she grabbed her bag and headed inside. The interior was frozen in time, filled with dusty furniture and the faint scent of lavender, her grandmother's favorite. Claire switched on the lights, grateful they still worked. She walked through the house, flicking on switches as she went, banishing the encroaching shadows. Everything seemed normal, if a bit neglected. After unpacking her bag, she settled into the living room. The night was still and dark outside the windows, the dense forest swallowing any light from the moon. Claire had planned to read, but the oppressive silence made concentrating impossible. Even the occasional creak of the house settling made her jump. She decided to head to bed early. The upstairs bedroom felt colder than the rest of the house, or the chill seeping through the walls. Claire climbed under the thick quilt and stared at the ceiling, trying to convince herself that she wasn't uneasy. Then she heard it. A faint tapping sound coming from the wall behind her. It was slow, deliberate, almost like a knock. Claire froze, her breath catching in her throat. She tried to rationalize it. An animal, maybe? The old house settling? But the sound was rhythmic, purposeful. Tap, tap, tap. She turned over, staring at the wall, as if expecting it to answer her unspoken question. The tapping stopped, leaving a suffocating silence in its wake. After a few minutes, she convinced herself it was nothing and closed her eyes. Exhaustion finally dragged her into an uneasy sleep. At some point in the night, Claire woke up. Something had pulled her from her sleep, a noise she couldn't place. The room was pitch black, the darkness so thick it felt like a weight pressing down on her. Then she realized why she had woken. The tapping was back. This time it was louder, coming from multiple walls. Tap, tap, tap. It moved, circling the room like someone or something was pacing just beyond the walls. Claire's heart hammered in her chest as she fumbled for her phone. The weak glow of the screen did little to chase away the darkness. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. "Is someone there?" The tapping stopped. The silence was worse. Every nerve in her body screamed at her to leave, but she couldn't bring herself to move. Then, slowly, she heard it again. Not tapping this time. Scratching. Long, deliberate strokes, like nails dragging against the wood. The sound was coming from the closet. Claire's stomach dropped. She stared at the closed closet door, her breathing shallow. She tried to convince herself it was her imagination, but the scratching grew louder, more insistent. She had to look. She couldn't sit there, frozen in terror, waiting for whatever was on the other side to come to her. Slowly, she slid out of bed, her feet touching the icy floor. She grabbed her phone and crept toward the closet, each step feeling heavier than the last. The scratching stopped the moment she reached the door. Her hand hovered over the doorknob, her mind screaming at her to stop. But something stronger, curiosity, or maybe the need to prove she wasn't losing her mind, drove her forward. She yanked the door open, holding her phone's flashlight up. The closet was empty. Just old coats, moth-eaten and sagging on their hangers. Nothing else. Claire let out a shaky laugh, relief flooding her body. She must have been hearing things. The stress of being alone in the house, combined with her exhaustion, was messing with her. She shut the closet door and turned back to the bed. That's when she saw it. A figure stood in the corner of the room, just beyond the reach of her phone's light. It was tall, unnaturally thin, its body contorted in a way that didn't seem human. Its face, or what should have been its face, was nothing but a blank, featureless void. Claire stumbled backward, her phone slipping from her hand and clattering to the floor. The weak beam of light spun wildly, momentarily illuminating the figure as it stepped closer. Its limbs moved jerkily, as if it wasn't quite sure how to use them. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. Her legs refused to move, her body frozen in place as the figure loomed over her. Its blank face tilted, as if studying her, and then it spoke. Its voice was a low, guttural rasp, barely above a whisper. "You shouldn't have come back." The lights flickered, and then everything went black. When Claire's family came to check on her the next day, the house was empty. Her car was still in the driveway, her bag unpacked, her phone lying on the bedroom floor. There was no sign of Claire anywhere. The only thing they found was the closet door, wide open, deep scratches etched into the wood inside. The train station was nearly deserted. The last train of the night long gone. Emily sat on the cold metal bench beneath a flickering fluorescent light, scrolling through her phone while she waited for her ride. Her friend had promised to pick her up, but they were late, and the eerie stillness of the station was starting to gnaw at her nerves. The distant hum of a vending machine and the occasional drip of water from somewhere in the rafters were the only sounds. She glanced at the large clock on the wall. 1:47 a.m. Just 15 more minutes, she told herself. Then she'd call her friend again. The sound of footsteps echoed from the far end of the platform. Emily sat up straighter, peering into the shadows. A man was walking toward her. His pace was slow, deliberate, his face obscured by the dim light. Something about the way he moved set her on edge. It was too measured, like every step was being carefully calculated. "Hey," he called out, his voice startling her. It was calm, but there was an edge to it, something that made her stomach twist. Waiting for someone? Emily hesitated before responding. "Yeah, my friend's picking me up." She tried to sound casual, but her voice wavered. The man stopped a few feet away, his face finally coming into view. His features were sharp, almost too perfect, as if they'd been carved from stone. His eyes, though, they didn't quite match. One was slightly higher than the other, and the pupils seemed too large, swallowing the light around them. "Long wait at this hour," he said, smiling faintly. "Dangerous, too." "I'll be fine," she replied quickly, gripping her phone tighter. The man nodded, but didn't move. He just stood there, staring at her, the faint smile never leaving his lips. Emily glanced at her phone, pretending to check her messages. When she looked up again, the man was gone. Her heart leapt into her throat. She scanned the platform, but there was no sign of him. The only way off the platform was the staircase leading up to the street, and she would have heard him if he'd left. Trying to shake the unease creeping over her, Emily got to her feet. She decided to wait near the staircase where it felt less isolated. As she walked, the flickering light overhead went out, plunging the platform into darkness. Her breath caught as she turned on her phone's flashlight, the weak beam barely illuminating the space around her. She quickened her pace toward the stairs, her boots echoing loudly against the concrete. Then she heard it, a soft scraping sound, like something being dragged across the floor. It came from behind her. Emily froze, her pulse thundering in her ears. She didn't want to turn around, but the sound grew louder, closer. Slowly, she turned her flashlight toward the platform. The man was there, standing at the far end, but he wasn't walking. He was crawling. His limbs bent at unnatural angles, his movements jerky and inhuman. His head tilted to the side as he stared at her, that same unnerving smile stretching wider across his face. "Leaving already?" he asked, his voice distorted like it was coming from a broken speaker. Emily didn't respond. She ran. The stairs felt impossibly far as she sprinted toward them, her flashlight bouncing wildly. The scraping sound followed her, faster now, accompanied by the faint echo of the man's laughter. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp, like nails on glass, and it sent chills down her spine. She reached the stairs and stumbled up them, her legs burning. When she burst out onto the street, she didn't stop running. The station loomed behind her, its entrance dark and silent. Emily finally reached a main road, gasping for breath as headlights appeared in the distance. A car pulled up, and her friend rolled down the window, looking concerned. "What happened to you?" her friend asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Emily didn't answer, her eyes fixed on the direction of the station. She climbed into the car, locking the doors as soon as they started moving. When she glanced back through the rear window, she saw him. The man was standing at the edge of the shadows, his head tilted, his smile impossibly wide. He raised a hand and waved. Weeks later, Emily tried to forget what had happened, convincing herself it was just her imagination. But sometimes when she walked home late at night, she would hear it again, that faint scraping sound just behind her. And when she turned, there would be no one there, at least not at first.